Well, good morning, all. Good to see you again. Tons of exciting stuff happening in the world, and I have a half an hour to get through it. This is the last week of doing Bible prophecy and current events, but there's just a fountain load of information. So I wanted to try to provide some biblical context, and this is a maybe. I know there's lots of interpretation of the king of the north. A lot of people have historically said it's Syria. A lot of people have said it's Russia because of Gog and Magog. I would put to you that it's both because Syria is now owned by Russia, but this is some of the character traits just to look out for. If this isn't your interpretation, that's totally fine. But it says, near the end of their kingdoms, and this is speaking after the Greek and Roman times, when the rebels have reached their full measure of sin and the insolent king, skilled in intrigue, will come to the throne, his power will be great, but it will not be his own. He will cause terrible destruction and succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the powerful along with the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper through his cunning and by his influence. And in his own mind, there will make himself great. He will destroy many in a time of peace, and will even stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be shattered, but not by human hands. So I know that this has also been interpreted as, I think, papal powers as well. What are other interpretations that people have heard really quickly? Anybody else?
These verses here?
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure, but seems like Harold Lafferty has a different interpretation about it.
Well, I think he and I agreed on this one, so that's why I was just wondering if anybody else had heard
Oh, I see.
other stuff, and Tanner Hawkins is working on it too. So
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to share this with you, and then the other one, let's get my slide to advance, is from Daniel 11. If somebody doesn't mind reading, because I know the font is small, it's verse 36 through 45. Yeah, go ahead, Beck.
Then the king of the north will do whatever he wants. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and he will say outrageous things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, because what has been decreed will be accomplished. He will not show regard for the gods of the fathers, the God longed for by women, or any other god, because he will magnify himself above all. Instead, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God his fathers did not know, with gold, silver, and precious stones and riches.
Just stop there for 1 second.
Sure.
So I think what's interesting here is they're talking about Russia in these terms right now, that it's a nation of a fortress, because they're all on their own. They've been cut off from the rest of the world. And this week is the week that Putin basically put out sanctions and said, Putin sanctions against him. He said, anybody who puts a sanction against us, this is a declaration of war. He's put all of his nuclear arsenal on full alert. That means the small ones, the big ones, the ones on submarines. And I want to make sure I say something very, very clearly. Do not call this man crazy or insane. Why? Because it takes away the culpability, the accountability of his actions. We shouldn't say that about Hitler or Mussolini. These were not crazy men. They had great tactics and strategies for evil. So don't remove their culpability. Don't say they're crazy. Don't say they're insane. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he's doing it purposefully. So I just want you to see a lot of these key elements in here are true right at this minute. So continue. Sorry.
He will deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will greatly honor those who acknowledge him, making them rulers over many and distributing land as a reward.
Okay, so he's done that right now. Tell me about his oligarchs. They're richer than Richie Rich. I mean, $17 billion is a whole BBC article on every single one of the oligarchs and how they made their money and how Putin helped them. And the reward has been outrageous. It's incredible, but who are his oligarchs? Former KGB, that, Jason?
occurred, they broke up a lot of the state-owned primary agencies. Agencies make it sound like it's a government piece, but it's
Infrastructure.
all industry, right? They broke it up. And as they broke it up, certain people were given different pieces of it. They became the sole owner of that piece, a monopoly, if you were, making lots of money in the transition from communism to capitalism because it wasn't diversified as in most capitalistic countries.
Right, exactly. So that's a great explanation for how his oligarchs got money. They're now running Suno business. Back to Rebecca so she can finish the chapter.
At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, but the king of the north will storm down against him with chariots, horsemen, and many ships. He will invade countries and sweep through them like a flood. He will also invade the beautiful land, and many will fall. But these will escape from his power: Edom, Moab, and the prominent peoples of the Ammonites. He will extend his power against the countries. Not even the land of Egypt will escape. He will get control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver and over all the riches of Egypt. The Libyans and Cushites will also be in submission. But reports from the east and the north will terrify him, and he will go out with great fury to annihilate and completely and utterly destroy many. He will pitch his royal tents between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain, but he will meet his end with no one to help him.
So this is a major passage to just think about. I'm not being dogmatic at all. Please understand. We're just seeing if this fits, like a shoe. We're seeing if it fits. You know, if it's the wrong thing or the right thing, you've got to judge for yourselves how well this fits, or if there's something else that fits better. But right now, verse 43 is in the news. Anybody know about that one? Martha up here? She's not up here. So they found a major cache of historic gold, not of historic gold, of new gold in Egypt, worth several $billion. And of course, Russia's very interested in getting a part of that. So things are changing quite quickly. Did you read the whole thing, Beth? Okay, thank you. Well, so there's a lot of things to think about here, a lot of characteristics to look at, just for thinking. And then I wanted to get into some of the things that are going on very quickly. So in the middle of these huge evacuations, because they tried to call a ceasefire, right? So people are trying to get out. They're trying to get into the cities, get out of the cities, get on the buses and go. In the middle of all this, total chaos, they start firing again while people are trying to sneak out of their basements and get on a bus to leave the country. So things are very, very bad. Russian President Vladimir Putin likened Western sanctions to a declaration of war on Saturday and warned that any move to create a no-fly zone over Ukraine would be viewed as participation in the conflict. And up above that, Russia has encircled the bombardment of Mariupol for days, leaving the key port city without water, heat, or electricity. A travel advisory has been issued telling U.S. citizens giving travel to Russia to depart immediately. So everybody who's American needs to get out of Russia. I thought that would be an Captain Obvious thing, but apparently not. And Putin is basically saying, if you got any sanctions against us or this against us, I am going to view that as a declaration of war by your country, which is pretty incredible. Putin's latest rhetorical escalation of tensions came hours after the effort to evacuate civilians from the besieged city of Mariupol was suspended when Ukraine and Russian forces violated temporary ceasefire with an ongoing barrage of shelling. An apparent collapse of the first agreement to create humanitarian corridors in the country understood the perilous existence of civilians facing a Russian assault that has brought death and destruction in its democratic neighbors. So that's not the only town that this happened in. It's happened in several others. We may say about all this, it's biblical prophecy. The only thing there is nothing in Scripture that directly applies to Ukraine and Russia, other than he's going to be the aggressor. What I would caution us all to be careful of is saying, well, this is what God wants, this is how it's supposed to happen, and be unfeeling about it. That's the scary part to me, because during World War II, people could say, oh, well, the Jews, this was predicted that they were going to die on the Holocaust. That's a very cold manner of thinking about it. We should be constantly showing empathy and compassion, even when these horrible things happen, especially to Ukraine and others. So let's keep the empathy and the compassion, even though these things take place. Yes, Randy.
That shelling that you were speaking of while people were trying to leave is on the radio as recently as this morning.
Yes, absolutely. So he said there would be a 4-hour ceasefire so they could leave, and then during the middle of this, he's shelling them. This is another axiom I kind of go by, you can adopt it or not, which is, how do you know what Putin's going to do? How do you know what his actions are going to be? I'm sorry? Right,
It's a positive thing.
right. So my advice to you that I found pretty true in everything he's done, don't listen to anything he has to say, just watch what he does. Because if you listen to him, you're going to get very confused, because he's going to do the opposite of whatever he says, and that is, big D word, deception. And he's the master of it. So that's a good way to think about it, because otherwise it gets out of control. Can I get a reader for the left part? Thank you, Becky. I need fast volunteers because we got a lot to go.
Russia has encircled and bombarded Mariupol for days, leaving the key port city without water, heat, or electricity.
Oh, I did this one. I'm so sorry.
You said
This
the
one.
left, so.
This one
okay.
is about trapped students who are trying to get out and they can't get out of the city. Go ahead.
At least 1,700 foreign students are trapped in the northeastern Ukrainian city of Sumy as shelling from the Russian army continues for a 10th day after humanitarian corridors failed to materialize. Shivangi Shibu, a 25-year-old medical student from India, was woken up in her university hostel at dawn on Saturday by loud explosions. If I have to describe my day, I would say it started with the sound of missiles or bombs at 5 a.m. Then we heard street fighting, gunshots. We were all running towards the bunker, panicking. And then again, around 10 a.m., we heard another bomb, the student recounted. We are scared and mentally exhausted, she said, adding that there are about 700 Indian students stranded in the city.
Okay, so there's lots of different ethnicities that are there in Ukraine, and they're all trying to get out, and the situation's getting worse and worse for them to find an opportunity to get out when there's not shelling going on. So Putin says sanctions over Ukraine are a declaration of war. He said this with 2 stewardesses or flight attendants on either side of him, which made a good photo op. So can someone read this one? Someone who's close up? Go ahead, Connor.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has described sanctions imposed by Western nations over his invasion of Ukraine as akin to a declaration of war. But thank God it has not come to that, he added. Mr. Putin also warned that any attempt to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine would be seen as participation in the armed conflict. And he rejected suggestions that he would introduce a state of emergency or martial law in Russia. Mr. Putin made the remarks while speaking to a group of women flight attendants at an Aeroflot training center near Moscow. Since the start of Russia's invasion 10 days ago, the West has imposed a raft of sanctions on Russia, including the freezing of Mr. Putin's foreign assets and the exclusion of a number of Russian banks from the SWIFT international payment system. In addition, many multinational firms have ceased operations in Russia. On Saturday, Zara, PayPal, and Samsung became the latest global brands to suspend trading there. The economic measures have already caused the ruble to plunge in value and forced the Russian central bank to double interest rates.
So they went from 9.5 to 20% in a day. That's how much the interest rates went up. And everybody's cutting them off, from Prada to Google to Twitter to, it doesn't matter which company, because now everybody's on the social bandwagon to get this done. The other piece is the sanctions themselves. Okay, so the SWIFT bank is the monetary way in which banks communicate with each other and trade money. Once you're off of that, you're basically out of the club. But the fear is this: if Russia and China work together, they could create an alternate solution to get out from under all of that. Number two, they haven't plugged the hole of cryptocurrencies, right? so they can change their rubles into crypto and then trade that way and get out from underneath it all. So these are all things that are very fearful, because if they're successful in doing this, they can get the dollar off the international standard, which would make us financially crippled. Yes, Brandon.
He's also trying to block access of his own people to outside news sources.
Oh,
so
that's
that they do
coming.
not know. Is that coming up?
Yeah, the BBC has actually had to put up all this information. I didn't put it on here for sake of time, but they're basically saying the only way to get their news is to go to this website and to do this, because Russia's blocking all the media coming from the West getting into Russia, and they're doing the same thing. They're not allowing them to news outlets to broadcast from inside Russia out. So you're absolutely right.
Anybody who speaks of anything other than what I want you to know is a criminal, basically.
Right. So he's cutting all the communications off, just like China. Jason.
If you speak against Putin. The other thing is the statement that is made about the sanctions being a declaration of war.
Yeah.
And I think it is ironic, right? Because what he is doing is a declaration of war against the people of Ukraine and potentially the rest of the world if they get involved as well. So he's saying we are declaring war if we do this, when in fact he's already declared war by doing what he is doing.
Exactly. I mean, it's dripping with hypocrisy. It's dripping with situation irony because of what he's done. So this is the latest piece. I just wanted to show in the South how much they've taken. So they took Crimea in 2014, and Melitopol and Mariupol are very important port areas. And he's sweeping from the north, and Donetsk and Luhansk, I don't know how to say that, Luhansk on the eastern border. So they're taking a lot of cities now, and in the cities where they have taken control, what has happened? Anybody know? Huge protests. So that's pretty amazing. Can I get a reader for this one? Go ahead, Leah, and then we'll do Randy next.
In his latest comments, Mr. Putin sought to justify the war in Ukraine, repeating his assertion that he was seeking to defend Russian-speaking communities there through the demilitarization and denazification of the country.
So that's really interesting, because who is running the country? A Jew, Zelensky. There's a huge population of probably over 200,000 in Ukraine who are still Jewish. So he's actually using this term against Jewish people, saying they're Nazis against the Russians, which has never been the case. But go ahead, sorry.
Responding to Western defense analysts, allegations that the Russian military campaign was going less well than expected, he said, "Our army will fulfill all the tasks. I don't doubt that at all. Everything is going to plan."
The funny part about all that is, and I had to laugh, out loud, as they say, about this, is that all these huge convoys, one of them was 40 miles long, they come into the country and they run out of gas. I was like, that is hysterical. They got two massive pipelines feeding all of Europe with fuel, and their tanks run out of gas or food or other supplies. So if Patton were still alive, he'd be laughing, because he was great at tank warfare. But this has just been so embarrassing on the international front. Go ahead, Leah, last bullet.
He added that only professional soldiers were taking part in the hostilities, and there were no conscripts involved, despite reports to the contrary.
That's a big lie, because what has Ukraine said about the Russians that they have captured? They're teenagers. They've been conscripted. They've been forced to do this. They don't know what they're doing, and that's why there's been so many convoy breakdowns after all of this. So Brandy, you want to read the slide? Go ahead. This is the no-fly zone area over Ukraine. Go ahead.
Russian leader said efforts to impose a no-fly zone in Ukraine would be considered by Russia to be a step into the military conflict, and those responsible would be treated as enemy combatants. The current leadership needs to understand that if they continue to do what they're doing, they risk the future of Ukrainian statehood, he's added. For his part, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has condemned NATO for ruling out the no-fly zone. However, Western leaders say introducing the measure would be an escalation. Mr. Putin also said that he had no plans to declare martial law in Russia, adding that such a step would only be taken in instances of external aggression in defined areas of military activity. But we don't have such a situation, and I hope we won't have one, he said. I got a question. Has the sanctions done anything to the availability of goods for the common people in Russia?
Incredibly, it's very bad. There have been the runs on the Russian banks. People can't get money, and of course, the supply chain has completely stopped. One of the ones I didn't get to put in here, which I just was laughing about, France, who doesn't seem to have a very strong military force since Napoleon, basically stopped a massive cargo ship bound for Russia and held it up. It was full of cars. So I had to laugh because I was like, well, that one's out. They'll be buying used cars again in Russia this year. But there was a lot of these different people have put huge sanctions. Companies have refused, including Visa and MasterCard. They've dropped all of Russia, as have many other businesses. So the sanctions are getting very crippling. It's the worst in history, as far as I know, yet.
On the previous slide, well, part of Putin's excuse is he's trying to denazify Ukraine. And last night, I don't know if it was an official German account, but some German account tweeted and said, those aren't really the Nazis we should know, speaking as the neighbors of Germany too. But basically, the Nazification of Germany of Ukraine is Belarusian, coming from Russian originally too.
Yeah, and the Belarus has been absolutely sanctioned as well as Russia because of their involvement. So both countries have been nailed down. Yes, real quick.
So the picture here is kind of misleading when it's talking about a no-fly zone. What you have here in this picture has to do with airlines and their flights all avoiding any of the conflict that's going on in the Ukraine. So that's what that picture there is. The term no-fly zone doesn't necessarily have to do with public airlines, but it has to do with restricting military flying and bombing that the Russians would do. And Russia has said, if you implement a no-fly zone, also a declaration of war. And right now, the UN hasn't implemented a no-fly zone,
Nobody
which would
has,
apply to
but
military
Russia
flights.
has control of their airspace,
Right.
is what I'm trying to say.
So a no-fly zone implemented by the UN would then take into account enforcement of that and starting to shoot down Russian fighters.
Right, and that hasn't happened. What I'm saying is that nobody can fly around Ukraine because Russia has control of their airspace.
I read an article around Switzerland because they had basically said they weren't letting any Russian come in, and they actually, I thought they shot some down.
So that's been the worldwide thing, is that almost all the countries in Europe, Canada, and the US have declared you can't fly any Russian planes here. As a matter of fact, one flew into Canadian airspace. It was Flight 111, and they had a whole inquiry about why it was in their airspace. So right now, I would just say Ukraine doesn't have any active flying over it because the Russian Air Force is basically over the whole thing. And there's great fear for commercial airlines that this will happen. Did we read all this? I can't remember. Okay. So back in England, Boris Johnson has issued a 6-point plan of reaction to Russian invasion of Ukraine, and is urging other leaders to endorse the effort to ensure Russia fails its apparent attempt to take over a democratic neighbor. The British Prime Minister proposal does not involve Western allies engaging in military action with Russia. That was released on Downing Street today. So they're all working together to try to stop this. The UK is firmly behind it. Everybody's trying to give some weapons to them. I know the U.S. delivered some already in February, I believe, and has delivered 2/3 of what they promised was delivered in February, and the rest is still coming. There's a lot going on. I want to get to some of the other stuff. So the humanitarian situation is becoming catastrophic, and there's so much happening, and people are trying to get out, as we said before, and every time there's a ceasefire, people are being shelled at. Can I get someone to read just the left part? real quick, yes.
Just the left part?
Oh, you can read the whole thing if you can go fast, yeah, that's fine.
Okay, the whole thing. The humanitarian situation in the southern Ukrainian port of Mariupol is catastrophic, and it is vital that civilians be evacuated, a senior official from the NGO Doctors Without Borders has warned. The city has been under siege by Russian forces and is near the border with its larger aggressor in the southeastern part of Ukraine. A supposed ceasefire agreement there to allow civilians to be evacuated safely never really came to fruition. It is imperative that this humanitarian corridor, which could have been created today, but which has not really been put in place following the non-respect of the ceasefire, is put in place very quickly to allow the civilian population, women and children, to get out of this city. The situation is catastrophic and getting worse day by day. The agency further reports the strategic city and Azov's seaport is considered a key one for Russia to capture. Today, there is no more water. People have huge problems accessing drinking water, and this is becoming a crucial issue. There's no more electricity, there's no heating, food is running out, shops are empty. For several days, quite simply, there's been nothing coming in or going out of the city. Russia's defense ministry earlier declared the ceasefire to open a humanitarian corridor to allow the city's 450,000 strong population to begin to leave by bus and private cars.
Okay, so the big whoop-de-doo about this is Russia is, on some cases, giving the opportunity for people to get out of the country, but once they leave, will they be allowed back in? Now, once Russia takes over, anybody who's out of the country, I would think, is cut off. And so that's a big problem. And the other issue is there's nothing left for these people. They can't stay. There's not enough food or water to sustain them, let alone water and electricity to run things. So the situation is getting very dire, and the humanitarian case in Poland and Romania and the rest of them are endangered. I've even heard that Russia probably, I should say this from the very beginning, it's important that he takes Ukraine, because without that, he can't get back all the Eastern Bloc countries that he wants. And then he can focus on dealing with Israel, with Syria, which is also coming up. So to the north and south, this is what has happened so far. Thank you for reading that, Casey. Can I get another one for reading this one real fast?
On day 10 of the invasion, people hoping to escape besieged cities in Ukraine were forced back to the shelters after plans for a brief truce went away. The BBC Jules Gunter said, Russian forces continued to shell the city of Mariupol on Saturday, despite agreeing to a ceasefire just hours earlier, throwing an attempted mass evacuation of civilians into chaos. I'm right now in Mariupol. I'm on the street. I can hear shelling every 3 to 5 minutes, said Alexander, 44-year-old engineer and resident of the city. The green corridor set up to get people out was not working, he said. I can see cars of people who tried to flee, and they are coming back. It is chaos. 3 hours after the ceasefire was supposed to begin, Mariupol authorities announced they had postponed a planned mass evacuation because of the continued bombardment. And one thing about the getting people out, it sounds like it's humanitarian, but it also makes it easier for the Russians just to come right in and just take over without a fight.
It's a huge advantage. If you get rid of the whole population and then you take the army, you've got an empty country with just a captured military that they can export somewhere else. Yes, Randy?
Before any of this war started, I had read that Russia was not able to wage a long war. So if they can prolong it, it's to their advantage or to the advantage of the world. Right? That's why Russia's trying to do everything real fast. Because they don't have the ability to do a long war.
Right. And so he's basically, he's got to take this country because this is his doorway to the rest of Europe. It touches so many other countries that used to be Soviet that he has to have this to get the rest. So it's one domino falling after another. Ukraine's second city, Kharkiv, was already felt the effects, and so has Mariupol and other cities in the east. Russian invasion has once again been slowed by logistical bottlenecks, tactical mistakes, and terrifying teenagers who had not been told they were going to war. That's what I mean about the conscript. As well as resistance as fierce as anything the Chechens offered in 1995, he writes. Kevin Connolly, who was a correspondent for the BBC in Moscow in the 1990s, also reflected on history. He says there are moments when the tectonic plates of history shift beneath our feet and Europe is violently remade. It is time to recognize that we are at such a moment, but drawing the right lessons from those big moments when everything changes is not easy. So we know this happened. The whole map of Europe was completely redrawn after World War I. Then it was redrawn again after World War II. And think about the Axis powers during World War II. Who were they? That's it. This time we've got Russia, China, and Brazil. Well, who cares about Brazil? But these other two countries, China can make anything they want. They could let a billion of their people die, and they would still have the ability to replace them all. No, they don't have that army now, but China has done what over the last 2 decades? Build up their military, and they've stolen all of the US's manufacturing and technical papers. So they've done it from the Navy, they've done it from the Air Force, they've got the plans for the F-35, they've got the plans for our ships, they've got plans for our planes, and they don't have to do all the RDT&E. Does anybody know what the RDT&E is? Research, development, testing, and evaluation. They don't have to do any of that because they stole the plans from us and they can just go right into manufacturing. And so that's the issue, is that they can produce anything. And do they have enough money to do this? Oh yes, they do, because it's been one of the biggest wealth migrations out of the US into another country. This is just to say there's huge marches going on in the towns where the Russians have already taken over. People's homes are being burned and they're having to leave because of artillery strikes that are going on all around them. Global firms are closing and suspending their businesses, including PayPal, Samsung, Prada, which I know is really important to the Russians, and several other businesses. So every business is now jumping on the social media bandwagon to say, we're not selling or buying from anything from Russia, which sounds good. I'm sorry? No. Well, actually, there have been several in Russia, but they're immediately silenced. The police come in and drag them off and literally imprison them. So he's been on top of that. There's been a lot of stuff on the oligarchs. It's too much to get into, but I want to let you know that they all have sanctions against them. There's a wonderful BBC article on it. I invite you to read it so you know who the players are, but there's a lot to consider when you're talking about who they are and what they have power over.
That's Abramovich there, who owns the Chelsea football club.
Team.
He has denounced the war, and yet he's still being sanctioned. And there are others who are the same. So there must be still tentacles.
Yeah, the problem is
reasons for denouncing them, for sanctioning them, even though they have denounced the war.
Because you can't believe anything they say. You can only match what they do. Yes, Leah, real quick.
Were you gonna also touch on that Zelensky has called Bennett in Israel and asked them if they will mediate the conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, they've asked for that, and also to help get the Jews out of Ukraine and back to Russia, which we're also going to cover very shortly. So the oligarchs are being hit. Visa and MasterCard pulled completely out of Russia. Zelensky's asking lawmakers for help to get weapons, which we are shipping over there. 2/3 of them have already arrived. Israel's PM visit Moscow underlies urgent talks. Can I get, Leah, do you want to read this one real fast?
From top to bottom?
Yep, top to bottom.
Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett traveled to Moscow to hold talks with President Vladimir Putin earlier. I think yesterday, actually, it happened.
Yep.
The urgency of Bennett's visit was undermined by the fact that the Israeli Prime Minister, who's an Orthodox Jew, broke Shabbat, the Jewish day of rest, in order to fly to Moscow. Expectations can only be made under Jewish law in situations in which life is threatened. Bennett's trip was also kept under wraps until he was already in the Kremlin, holding some 2.5 hours of talks with President Putin. The two men have met several times before and appear to have a good relationship. The Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had earlier called on the Israeli Prime Minister to mediate in the current conflict. Among those accompanying Bennett was the Housing Minister Zeev Elkin, who has long served as a Russian translator for Israeli leaders. He was born in Kharkiv and has relatives still in Ukraine. Following the talks, PM Bennett traveled to Germany, where he is set to meet German Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
So, I mean, the prime minister is on a plane constantly, going to Russia, going to Germany, trying to get the Jews out. He's got to stay on the Russian good side because if you don't, huh?
He wants.
Syria would be one
Syria.
thing, but one of the bigger ones is how he's got to stay on their good side until he gets the Jews out of Ukraine. If he doesn't get the Jews out, then it will be because he had stirred up bad relationships with Russia. So these are pictures from the railway station in Ukraine and the capital of people trying to flee. Many have ended up adding more than 1 million that have already left the country. The total figure is expected to top 1.5 million by the end of the weekend, says the UN Refugee Agency. He's called it the fastest moving refugee crisis in Europe since the end of World War II. According to the latest UN figures, there are now 1.36 million Ukrainian refugees. More than half of them, 760,000, have traveled to Poland. Hungary has taken in 157,000, which is amazing because they don't like refugees. Yes.
As well. There was a picture of him with the head of, I don't know, if it's like the Eastern Orthodox Church or
Yeah.
whoever. Yeah, he come out and said like, hey, you know, I'm willing to help figure this out.
Yeah, the Pope in one of the previous slides we did weeks ago has been perfectly willing to be the international peacemaking venue for the world, and he's trying to set himself up in that role. So you're absolutely right.
I was going to mention, I also read that the Russians attempted to assassinate Zelensky this week, but they managed to get the intel. But he's really, the stuff you're seeing in Ukraine right now, at least from my perspective, is just like, it's like every man and woman and child is getting a gun, and like I think Russia wasn't prepared for this in any way.
No, not at all. And they're getting weapons that can take out tanks, not just little hand pea shooters. Okay, really quick. I don't have time to read all of this, but basically, I want to read one line from here that was really good. In the 20 years since, Putin has been trying to be engineering a different kind of global system, malfunction, and the destruction of liberal international order. The former KGB spy master, wanted to turn back the clock to revive Russia's czarist greatness and to restore the might and menace of the Soviet Union prior to the breakup in 1991. This Russian revanchist has become the most disruptive international leader of the 21st century, the mastermind behind much misery in Chechnya and Crimea, from Syria to the Cathedral of Salisbury. He has sought successfully at times to redraw the map of history. Really quick, I'm going to jump to this. So this is really interesting because a whole bunch of, sorry, go back. How did it skip? Okay, so many of, this thing will not stop. I'm sorry, guys. Please go. There we go. So basically, they have sent a lot of the Jewish children away from Ukraine to Germany, which is pretty amazing. And they're trying to get them out as quickly as possible. One more after this. At the end of this. I can't get it to advance. We'll just stop. Well, there's one more I wanted to show you. Come on, please go. I know, it's just not doing anything. Okay. Okay, there we go. So basically tens of thousands of Ukrainian Jews have applied to make an aliyah back to Israel, and many of them are going. So we'll stop it there. But I think this is one of the big purposes, is to get Jews back out of Ukraine into their homeland.